Sometimes we make the mistake of thinking that the complexity of the code is equivalent to the complexity that's expected at the next level. It's not really that. It's really about what is the problem, how nebulous is the problem statement, what do people expect from someone at your level versus people at the next level, and how you deliver.
Hey, my name is Felix Tia. I'm the host of the Culture of Code podcast, and each week we invite experienced and successful software engineers to reveal exactly what they've learned about growing and succeeding in the tech industry. In today's episode, we have Ritendra Datta, Director of Engineering at Meta. Ritendra built his career on applied machine learning back when machine learning was not as popular as it is right now. He realized that machine learning will be huge because of the volume of data produced year over year, which has grown tremendously. He worked at Google for 10 years, focusing on understanding search queries and built a team of 30 people, and eventually moved to Meta to work on Reels and video recommendations. Welcome, Ritendra.
Thank you for having me here.
Yeah, so you built your career, as mentioned, on machine learning from Google to now Meta. And sometimes the word machine learning is obviously much more popular now that maybe lots of folks out there that are either in their software engineering career already or thinking about it might not be completely familiar with what that kind of field is like, especially as a career path. Can you tell us more about what machine learning is and what is that career path like for a software engineer?
Yeah, definitely. That's a great question to start this off with. Machine learning is this whole field of computer science and statistics. It used to be a part of statistics, and now it's like mostly taken over by computer scientists and applied software engineers, whereby the machines are able to like use historical data to train models to sort of predict the future. So it's trying to emulate things about the future based on what it's seen in the past. So it's a field where you take a bunch of data, you feed that data into non-trivial, anywhere from very simple to very complex models that sort of represent the understanding from that data, derive the essence of that data, and then can apply it to future instances. For example, like a classic example is weather prediction, right? So we have years and years of data on weather at different parts of the world. Most weather prediction systems will just look at that historical data and be able to predict what the weather is going to be like to the down to minutes or even seconds. And they'll have a pretty good estimate of that. I think there'll be some surprises, some unknowns, but that's fine because prediction means that predictions are not going to be perfect. Predictions are evaluated based on how close they are to the real value when we actually see that real value. And of course, like that's kind of a classic real world example, but in the field of software, one of the things that large companies do a lot is predict user behavior because most people are building apps or websites where sort of what to show to people is predicated on like what they will engage with, and being able to predict that ahead of time is sort of the holy grail of what you show and how you get engagement going forward. Pretty much every user internet company is doing some sort of machine learning to predict engagement, such as, for example, like YouTube uses it for figuring out like what to recommend on its homepage, which videos to show to you so that you'll engage the most. So these are all various examples of machine learning. It's very interesting because the applications just keep growing, and increasingly like there are more and more sophisticated uses of machine learning. Like we have all been hearing about ChatGPT. That's a class of machine learning which we call generative machine learning or generative AI. You're predicting not just like one little thing like what's the temperature at this point of time and this particular point, but rather like what is a good way to answer complex answers to complex questions. So it's like we've advanced greatly over the years.
Yeah, I think with tools like ChatGPT has definitely brought a lot of interest into machine learning. So for someone that, let's say, is a student right now that is interested in a career path in machine learning, what kind of courses do you think that they should be taking, or what do you think they should be focusing on while they're in school?
Yeah, it depends. I think it could start as early as high school or even middle school or even elementary school, like, because you can start whenever you feel like you can be excited about it. But it can also be as late as after graduate school and many years into the industry. Like, there's no right or wrong time to start preparing for machine learning. And the right time is when you get excited about it. If you're an undergrad, if you're a high schooler and you feel passionate about machine learning, the thing to do would be to like, first of all, understand the fundamentals of machine learning. There are so many ways to do this. You don't need to take formal courses. Like there are a gazillion YouTube videos out there. There are a gazillion courses on websites like Coursera and other like Udemy and some of the other large scale online learning platforms. And you can just basically take a basic course and then just take it from there. One of the things I love to recommend to people in fields like machine learning, where most of us are not going to be doing advanced machine learning in research. That's something that requires you to have a ton of background. Most people want to just apply machine learning, like take off-the-shelf tools and like build experiences that are on top of machine learning infrastructure that already exists. And so for that, like one of the earliest first things to do is learn the basics and then actually build something simple from scratch yourself. Learning by example is one of the best ways to learn machine learning, in my opinion. I think like you can't do that without a basic understanding. So I would do it in that sequence. Like it's almost like if I were to draw like a set of career flow diagrams, I would almost always start with like understanding the fundamentals. What is training? What is prediction or evaluation? What's training data? How do you clean up that data? How do you sort of train a model using off-the-shelf tools? And then like build a tool, build a couple of experiences, then decide whether you want to do more of that or you want to actually go back and study this in more detail. Because roughly speaking, the two ways in which someone can grow in their career in machine learning is either through getting better and better at applied machine learning, where you're almost doing nothing with the technology itself. You're living at the surface, but you're just making the product better. The other is making the mathematics and statistics behind the machine learning better so that it does a better job for a wide range of applications. So that is a fork that you have to decide which direction to take based on your interest in like being more applied or being more theoretical. Because I think both have a ton of value. Like being applied means you're just making better products. Being theoretical means you're building a better machine learning infrastructure or AI infrastructure that the whole world can use and benefit from. So it really depends on like what are you aspiring to do. And the only way to know that is through like the step 1 and 2 that I mentioned, which is learn the basics, build something on your own, and then decide like how do you sort of pursue it further.
Yeah, I'm sure it also varies by company, but let's say a member of your team or like a report comes to you and is interested in transitioning into more machine learning discipline or machine learning engineer from maybe more typical like back-end engineering. What would their career path look like? What kind of advice would you give them, opportunities to learn that on the job and eventually transition into more of a machine learning engineer kind of role?
First of all, if someone has been in the software industry for a while, I would tell them to do one thing before even going to like the basics of machine learning, which is to go back and refresh their basic linear algebra and statistics and probability. I think everything in machine learning is built on the foundation of maths and statistics. So I think they'll get pretty quickly lost even going through basic courses. Because if you think about it, most software engineers are moving further and further away from mathematics and statistics. They're like just not required to do that, and it just like becomes their knowledge and understanding of that stuff becomes stale pretty quickly if they're an experienced engineer in the software industry. So do that first, then take some courses. That's kind of the easiest path. Like don't have to quit your job or go to a different undergrad degree or take another graduate course to get better at. It's such an applied field, especially if you want to stay in the applied machine learning field, which I think is the most obvious path for someone who's not had that background. Because I don't think it makes sense to like jump from having no background in machine learning to becoming an expert at machine learning theory. So I would recommend brushing up. Linear algebra can go extremely complex and deep, but I'm talking about the scratching the surface, refreshing the basics, and then do the same with probability and statistics. Then take a course. Again, as I said, like Coursera's and Udemy's and all of those are really good resources to like find a course, take it, audit it. Don't even have to like pay for it. There are plenty of courses that are just freely available and distributed. And then combine that with YouTube, where people explain snippets of concepts separately, which is really a good sort of additional tool to like further solidify your understanding of the basics. Then if you're already in a company where you are in an infrastructure or a product engineering team and you want to do machine learning, you can basically say, hey, can I spend like 10-20% of my time to like do a project with your team, find a machine learning team within your company and apply your understanding to one thing, like train a model. The most classic cycle is figure out what data sources exist. I think most engineers can write code to like pipe data from point A to point B. And then the next step is like, okay, pipe this data through the machine learning training infrastructure. It spits out a model and try that model out on a few sampled data that is held out and see how it goes, right? So I think it's going from not knowing anything about this to actually building a model from within your company, especially if you are in a company where there are machine learning teams, is going to be like a fantastic thing. If you're in a company that doesn't practice machine learning, when I talk to a lot of people in the industry, I'm surprised by how few companies are actually doing machine learning. It seems like there are so many open source tools available, but I think there is some resistance to moving into that field unless there's a conscious effort or there's a champion in the company to do that. So if you are lucky enough to be in a company where there are actually teams doing it professionally, then I think doing that would be a great way of like having that on your resume. And then once you have it on your resume, it's like, the world is your oyster.
Yeah, I think that that's true, that it's still very early days for machine learning, even though it's something that's been going on for years. I think a lot of companies have now fully adopted it, at least as its own kind of standalone discipline as much. Now, speaking of kind of self-learning, you credit a lot of your own career growth by reading books on management, listening to podcasts and audiobooks. What are some books or resources that really stood out to you that made the biggest impact on your own career growth?
Well, I started coding as a kid. And it's not for everyone because they don't necessarily have the resources. In today's date, it's different. When I was growing up, this was like, and I grew up in India till I was 21 and I moved to America. And I was very lucky that my dad had a computer and I was fascinated. I was at the age 8 fascinated by a book on BASIC. BASIC was this programming language that predated a lot of the more modern high-level programming languages. And I also got into assembly language through a book called Programmer's Problem Solver. The thing that inspired me to get into this is more of like, it's a very funny story. Like, I was very young in my family. I had other cousins and siblings that were older than me. Computers were the only thing that would listen to me. And coding was the one way to like have one thing in the world listen to me exactly as I told it to do. Nobody else would listen to me. It's a funny story, but that's how it went, right? But then a little bit more seriously, over the years, there have been a series of books. But I do think, like, if I were born in the 2000s, I would probably do it a bit differently. Pretty much everyone has access to, like everyone middle class and above, like would have access to some kind of computing device, including just their cell phone. And I think they would learn not through reading books, but applying them using tools. But I do think like podcasts like this one are going to be good resources to inspire. They're not a good way to like learn, because we are not going to discuss, hey, here's how you write an if statement. But you're definitely going to be sort of getting inspired by people's stories, and often use podcasts as a classic example of getting inspired. Like, I'm a filmmaker on the side. I listen to a lot of filmmaking podcasts and that inspires me. I learn almost nothing from them, but I always get inspired. So like, to me, books are increasingly less useful. YouTube videos and courses are a little bit more useful, and podcasts are for inspiration. So I would like bucket these resources as such. But I think some people might still find books useful, but I mean, imagine like you have a sort of a screen open where you have some kind of a course, or even like a digital version of a book, like copying, pasting that code into like an IDE and running the code is far better experience, learning than like reading. Like, this is what I did growing up. I would read a book for 6 days and then I would go to my dad's office where he had a computer. For 6 days I would just read, and then I would like write down code by hand and then type them in. On the 7th day when I used to get to go to his office because he took me with him. So that is not a good cycle, because like the turnaround time is like 7 days every time you make a mistake. So.
Yeah, so it sounds like you're a big believer in learning by doing. And I'm assuming some of these books that you read probably don't teach you about how to go from managing a 30-person team over at Google and now at Meta, a team of 200 people, of infra engineers and scientists. Tell us about that learning process. Like, how are you able to kind of scale your skill set up to be able to manage such a large team?
Yeah, I guess the answer is very similar, like learning by doing and having managers that believe in your ability to scale. I like this principle of fake it till you make it. So whenever in my career someone has said, "Hey, can you do it?" I often used to say like, "Yeah, I can," and then like I'd go home and be like, "Can I? I don't know." But like no one heard me say that. Next day I'm running a much larger team. And then I'm like, "Oh shoot, what mistakes am I making?" I made plenty of mistakes, right? Like in fact, the most egregious like mistake that I ever made in my management career was when my team size was only 3. Like I still remember when like in my team of 3, one of them said, "I want to leave this team and go to some other team." And after a while, I realized that their main reason was that they were unhappy. I didn't have the self-awareness to realize that I was micromanaging this person because they were not doing well. I was treating their performance as a reflection on my very small team and was trying too hard to make that 33% of my team also look successful because I thought that reflected poorly on me. And instead of letting that person fail and learn, I was trying to micromanage, and that just got to this person, and then they decided to leave. And I was left with a 2-person team. No book has ever told me how to do that, but I just learned through failure in that instance. The other thing is I actually have a very specific recommendation on management and scaling up. There's this podcast called HBR IdeaCast. It used to be my favorite podcast while driving before I switched to like filmmaking podcasts. But I still like listen to HBR IdeaCast from time to time. It's a very good resource. They've made it all available so you can listen to a whole bunch of talks by industry experts on management and leadership and those who know the difference between those two. And like listening to them, a big part of that is inspiration rather than learning. But like podcasts can also challenge you, specifically on like growing from 3 people to 200 people now. I feel like at every order of magnitude, my job has effectively changed, even if my role hasn't. The things I used to do at 3 was very different from what I used to do at 10, was quite different when I used to do at 30. So like roughly speaking, I actually think like my most distinct points of growth have been at a 3x scale. So 3, then 10, then 30, then 100, and now like 200. Like at this point 200 versus 300 doesn't matter. I think the techniques are going to be very similar to run the teams, but I do think like at each of these steps I had major learning experiences of like how do I set up my org, like what challenges do we face, what is the relationship between me and my reports, what is the division of labor between the group of us. A very simple example is increasingly I have very senior ranked in my reporting chain. So these very senior people, the way I treat them, the way I respect them, the way I ask them to do stuff, the way I engage with them is almost like a peer at this point. But when I had a team of 10, right, I had a bunch of very junior ICs on my team. And I think it was much more of a mentoring, and it felt more hierarchical because they literally looked up to me for instructions. And they were like figuring out, this is at Google, where these people are like oftentimes strong resume, very good at coding and algorithm design, but comes into the industry for the first, a lot of them, and they're really just looking to me for step-by-step instructions till they become independent. So hand-holding them was the big thing. Now I have people who are themselves running 50, 60, 100-person orgs. So like my conversations with them, my expectations from them are much more like peers. Like the way I see now my role is more of a peer rather than a superior subordinate. Like we divide and conquer everything. And if they need some coaching, if they need some help, I'm there for them, but that's not my main role anymore. It's much more about like partnering and pairing up and sort of dividing and conquering the work.
Yeah, I think one thing you mentioned too was about how early on you did not have the self-awareness to recognize where, with the situation of the micromanaging. How do you develop that self-awareness these days in order to know that your focus or your skill set should be on different things as your organization scales? And now, like you had mentioned, the duties, the day-to-day job that you do changes. How do you make sure that you're aware that now your attention is required elsewhere, or you should be focusing on different things now that you've gone from 30 to 100 people? How do you make sure you're aware of those inflection points?
That's a fantastic question, because it's totally not obvious how you sort of develop that muscle for self-awareness when things are constantly changing. One of the things about learning is you hold a lot of things constant, and then you sort of change a thing here and there, and you learn to A/B test your way through success, right? But when the whole environment is constantly changing, you don't, and there's so much, like a lot of this people versus people, and people also change, right? It's very hard to like just know for sure whether you are doing it wrong or someone else is doing it wrong when things don't go well. So I do think like the most consistent ways I've found to develop self-awareness and just do the right thing is to establish some relationships that you really trust, where the relationship is not tied to saying nice things about each other, but to be really brutally honest about what you do and how you do it. When you do feel some itch about some things that you think are not going well, or something that you yourself think might be doing better, than that you can go to that person and ask, hey, here's the situation. You observe what happened. Did I do it right? Is this the right approach? Find the right people who can then answer these questions is really important, because it solves like a huge amount of your problem. You're outsourcing that self-awareness, turning it into more of a feedback-based awareness development, and then eventually you build a muscle to like observe yourself in the third person. It's almost like the Buddhist way of like looking at life, where if you're really aware of your physical self, you should be able to see yourself from a third party point of view and observe yourself neutrally. I think like that philosophy really sticks to me. And that principle applies to pretty much everything in life, but especially to management. And because there's so many instances where you're constantly doing things, you're acting, you're reacting. It's easy to like take some of those instances where you're not too deeply involved in the conversations, but then you can observe yourself from a third party lens and figure out if you're coming across doing the right thing, taking the right actions, speaking the right words, inspiring in the right way, giving the right kind of feedback. So this is very iterative though. Like it's like what I'm saying is very easy to talk about and very hard to implement in real life. Most of us are often too defensive about our things, and I am like a lot of times I'm quite defensive about what I do, and it almost takes a while to like realize that there is no real point to defending myself. Because like if I don't defend myself but let the feedback in and question my approaches, I'm pretty sure the payoff from that will be far longer term. Being defensive might give me a short term win of feeling better about myself, but not being defensive and like taking feedback and improving is a much more longer term win. So to summarize, developing some allies in your environment who have no stake in the ground in being honest with you. They don't have to pretend to like you or anything. They can be brutally honest with you. Having an army of such people is great. Having even one or two such people is good enough. And then observing, like using that as a mirror, getting their feedback in environments where you both are present. And then finally developing that muscle to be able to see yourself from third person, even when your confidants or whatever you call them are not around, so that you yourself develop the muscle to critique yourself and give yourself feedback and question your approaches and techniques. And I think those are the three that I would do.
Now, one thing you mentioned to us was that during your career, shifting from a company like Google to now Meta, one thing you recognized was how much faster things moved over at Meta when it comes to launches compared to Google. Can you tell us more about that? What's the experience been like? What's the pros and cons with the speed of things over now that you're at Meta?
Yeah, I think like every company chooses to be in some. If you draw a 2D plot for each company, they have this like risk aversion versus risk taking and speed of execution. I think like most small startups are probably highly risk averse and like taking and moving really fast. Google, over the course of the 10 years that I was there, moved quite a bit from being risk taking to some extent and moving relatively fast. I wouldn't say super fast. I never saw Google move very, very fast. That's just from my vantage point. This is a large company. I only saw a slice of the company. So, from whatever I saw, the company never moved super fast, but it was always very cautious. And so, then over time, the launches and changes started to move even slower with layers of management and decision makers. And so over time, I saw in that plot Google move to be more risk averse and less execution focused. So I think like part of it also, I don't really blame. I mean, different companies operate based on what they see in their environment. Almost no one is really wrong about their approach, right? One of the things that I saw at Google was facing, you know, antitrust lawsuits in Europe and similar investigations in the US, and there were privacy snafus. So like it made sense for the company to like move more carefully, because in the balance it made sense for Google to move more carefully and cause more problems for themselves, because they had very steady business, or their ads business was very, very solid, and so they didn't really need to disrupt it and cause more trouble. That made sense for them. Meta, or Facebook as I knew it for the most part, Facebook was, and actually funnily I work on the Facebook product, so it's like I totally find it convenient to call it Facebook still. Had this, culture of moving fast and getting things done and being aware that things sometimes will break. There are probably a couple of instances where things broke in a really, really bad way, but for the most part, I actually think that Facebook's strategy of moving faster, much faster than Google in terms of execution, um, was a better trade-off, in my opinion. Because I think like if you call SEVs, as we call site events or whatever that acronym is, I think like yes, Facebook had more SEVs than, but on the balance, I don't think that trade-off was favorable for Google. I think Facebook moved faster, had fewer trade-off, but it moved much faster than the number of problems that it introduced because of moving fast. Also, like over time, I think the company has also like grown and matured, and definitely there is some shift in sort of what kind of risks the company wants to take. So, I mean, in some sense, all these companies are in different, life cycles. And I think like in my mind, Facebook is a shifted version of Google in terms of time horizon.
I think depending on your personality too, for where you thrive, this can be good or bad. Where maybe you might feel burnt out from all of the speed or the slowness or the bureaucracy maybe of things, or maybe burnt out from the speed of things. For engineers out there that are feeling this kind of burnout, what's your experience been with burnout in your career, and how have you been able to mitigate or manage it?
Again, it's very circumstantial. I'm very sympathetic to situations where you don't have much control over the environment you're in. For example, visa is a big problem in this country. A lot of people in tech are immigrants, and their situations are very different from citizens like myself. So, one thing that if you're basically always worried about losing your job, and then losing your job meaning losing your immigration status, then it just becomes a very tough thing, and I am very sympathetic to that. But leaving that aside, I do think for those who are not under these kinds of external pressures to perform or to do something, I think burnout can be controlled, and I never encourage people to burn out. Whenever I have gone to that territory, I have sort of pulled back and mixed up my work life with other things to really find other ways to feel better about myself. Ultimately, most things are about feeling good about yourself, like whether it's your job, how much money you make, what you're building, and how else you're spending your 24 hours. And I feel like if your job is not fully satisfying, burnout is going to happen even if you're not working 18 hours a day. Burnout is often a matter of like not feeling very satisfied in the work you do. Although I think the other one is also possible where you like what you do, but you're spending way too many hours. So there are at least two different kinds of burnouts. But like, at least for the former, where you're burned out because you don't like what you do, not because of how many hours you put in, I do think you have a choice of like finding something different and pushing yourself to like find something, whether it's within your company or whether it's somewhere else. Finding your passion really can change what will burn you out. If you really enjoy what you do, I think you'll generally be able to absorb many more hours. And I've always experienced that in my life. And what I have done, I've somewhat escaped this by whenever I've felt overwhelmed because I didn't enjoy what I did, because that has been my number one source of burnout. I've never really burnt out by the hours I've worked because I've always time boxed the number of hours I work. When I've changed companies or jobs or roles or my approach to work, it's easier said than done again, but I think we should strive for that. And if you start now, if you are listening to this and you are feeling burnt out because you're not inspired by the work you do, give yourself some time, like n number of months, to find something different. There are some corner cases that are tricky. For example, if you're very close to a promotion, it might be pragmatic to like power through it, get your promotion, then like do something else. I think you have to like balance these. I'm generally pragmatic about these things. I think like I don't like these slogans where you say, oh, you shouldn't work another day of this, blah, blah, blah. Well, if you're this close to a promotion and it has an economic impact on your life going forward, don't just quit. Just power through maybe a few more days or whatever. Of course, like not everyone will even want to endure that, which is totally fine. But I think you just want to like make sure you're looking at all aspects of what are the sources of your burnout. What are the escape routes from that state of burnout? Can you wait 3 more months, get a promotion, then change your job or company or manager? A lot of times your relationship with your manager can cause a burnout. I've had managers that like completely make me feel comfortable with no matter what the situation is. It almost like your manager prevents you from a burnout by the words they use. And it can also go the other way around, where the manager gives you so much stress that you're constantly burnt out. And your anxiety goes up every time you meet your manager. So those things happen, right? So be pragmatic, list down all the things that are causing burnout, hours of days worked, the degree of passion with which you're working, the relationship with your manager and your peer group, the level of inspiration you're deriving out of the product that you're building or the service that you're building. Those factors should like, and then how close you are to a career jump. If you factor all those in, I think you'll get an answer, but you have to be systematic about analyzing that.
Yeah, and speaking of something like promotions, one of the common questions that you get from ICs that want to get promoted are around whether they should bring in more complexity into the projects that they lead or that they're a part of. What's your advice here on that kind of thinking, where the bigger the project, the more complex it is, the more, I guess, evidence that you could put into like a promotion packet?
That's a great question. And I think like pretty much every company of worth has written down their promotion levels according to where there is at least one dimension of levels, which is about increasing complexity and scope of projects. I do think people use both scope and complexity so that it allows for you to grow when the complexity of the project is coming from the scope rather than from like the mathematics or the kind of code that you have to write. Sometimes we make the mistake of thinking that the complexity of the code is equivalent to the complexity that's expected at the next level. It's not really that. It's really about what is the problem, how nebulous is the problem statement, what do people expect from someone at your level versus people at the next level, and how you deliver. So I think it is important to grow your problem scope. And the complexity could come in many forms. It could be that you're doing something no one else is doing in the industry or in your company, or it could be that you're doing it at a scale that no one else has attempted before, or it could be that even your manager and your reporting chain doesn't know how to solve a problem and you come up with that. So there are different ways in growing scope and complexity, and I think a lot of times the best ways to sort of pitch yourself for the next level through scope and complexity is to pitch it yourself. really survey the land that you're in and basically say, hey, I'm doing this. This feels like an opportunity that no one is working on. Can you have a conversation with your reporting chain? Hey, can I go into that territory and expand my scope on my own? Like a lot of times I find ICs wait to be given opportunity. I don't see people creating opportunities for themselves as much. The reality is, by nature, humans are inherently selfish. And so they mostly think about themselves. You like to think that everyone is thinking about you, but most people are just thinking about themselves, right? So even when it comes to creating opportunities for you, you are the most likely candidate to create more opportunity for yourself by making a compelling case for it. Right? This is something I learned from grad school, where in grad school I was so on my own often, where like most problem statements came out of me. Then I would go to my advisor and say, hey, can I work on this? Can this be a problem that the industry or academia cares about? So I got that training in grad school, and sort of I find that to be very useful in pure software engineering industries as well. It comes across in two ways. One is you have control over the destiny of that project, which means you get first dibs on a project, on an area, because you talked about it before everyone else. People generally think that, okay, you've been talking about it, you deserve to be given an opportunity to work and expand your scope into that area or complexity, whichever it is, or preferably both. And then second is like, how do you sort of pitch it in a way that feels compelling? Rather than saying, hey, we should do this because other people are doing it, you should like make a business case. Like ICs should also think like business people, in that they're selling a project, they're making a business case for why this project should be worked on. And if that is compelling, then they are the top choice usually to be working on it. And it also demonstrates to their leadership that they have the ability to find new problems and make a dent there. So I would encourage you to be entrepreneurial within traditional companies when it comes to expanding your scope, which is something I actually see very little of. And I find that those who do that, a lot of other ones that are progressing fastest in their career.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ritendra, Director of Engineering at Meta. Thank you so much for coming on and sharing your story and your experience.
Thank you, Felix. This was really good questions.
And that's all the time we have for this episode. Come hang out with us next time on The Culture of Code. Again, my name is Felix Tia. Take care.